We could. There we are. Okay, so you could see what you can see. So I'll do the introduction while everybody is sitting down, and then everybody should be settled by the time we're ready to start. Hello, everyone. I'm Terry Schwartz from the Cleveland Urban Design Collaborative, and on behalf of the College of Architecture at Kent State, I'd like to welcome you to the third and final lecture in our fall lecture series, Cities and Material Landscapes. We're really excited for today's talk. This is really the first time we've had someone from out of state here in person since 2019. So this is a big moment for us. We want to make sure and thank our partners at the Ohio chapter of the American Society of Landscape Architects. For those of you who are ASLA members, you can get continuing ed credits for this session. For those of you here in person, there's a form that you'd want to pick up before you leave. For those of you joining us online, the form will be in the chat box. Also, for the virtual participants, you'll see some quiz questions that Jill has crafted for you that turn up in the chat box. So you can respond to those as part of the continuing ed certification process. We also have continuing ed credits from the Ohio chapter of the American Planning Association. So if any of you are planners and are looking for those credits, you can just log on to your APA or AICP account, and it should come up, and you should be able to record today's session for continuing education. So with that, I just want to take a minute to introduce and thank Jill Desimini for coming to join us today. She's a landscape architect and an associate professor at the University of Connecticut. She's trained as both an architect and a landscape architect. She's worked in the private sector for design firms and has practiced in both architecture and landscape architecture. Prior to joining the University of Connecticut, she was at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. I actually met Jill 10 years ago.
Video.
It was
but not true.
it was a long time ago, 10, 12 years ago, because, we have a lot of shared interests between the CUDC and Jill's work related to vacant land and urban ecologies. Jill's current research investigates potential futures for abandoned landscapes with an emphasis on climate and justice. She's the author of Cyclical City, which she'll talk about today, this beautiful brand new book. And also previously from Fallow, 100 Ideas for Abandoned Urban Landscapes, along with many other publications. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jill. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the introduction. It's exciting to be here. I haven't been in Cleveland for a long time. I've never flown in. So when I got to the airport, I realized I had no idea actually where the airport was relative to the rest of the city. But thank you to Kent State and the CUDC for hosting, and also for the work you do. I really admire it. And so it's nice to be here among so many people. Yeah, and I just want to say thank you to you guys, but also thank you. I'm going to talk about this book, Cyclical City, which, as you may have noticed, has a different cover because this was too muddy to see, which is true of the screen here. But I am excited to present it. It's really been a long time coming. And so I want to thank UVA Press for publishing it. And since Terry already dated me, it's been basically a decades-long project. It's one that's ongoing. It will probably continue to go until decline is no longer being systematically produced, or maybe until I just get too old, but hopefully the latter will happen before the former will happen before the latter. So it thinks to the future design approaches, and it looks back at kind of long and complex histories. And as Terry mentioned, it's really one project out of which came two books. So one is this book of ideas that's called From Fallow. And originally I thought I was going to do case studies of best practices. And so that's what I was thinking. And then I thought, there's a lot of really quick ideas that haven't really been grounded or understood in a longer context. And so I collected so many of these great ideas, which are other people's ideas, which I enjoy collecting and sort of drawing and thinking through. So I wanted to do something with that, but I also wanted to recognize this kind of longer stories. So this book is really about much longer stories. And I owe a lot of thanks to my students and colleagues, friends and family, whose contributions have been countless. If any of you have made a book, it's like really a labor of love, but also a collaboration. So it's kind of wrong that it's just my name on there. So Angela Taylor, UJ, Emmanuel Gracie spent some summers working on drawings, and Rosetta, Jane, Michael, Bob, Joao, Maria, Sonia reviewed text, and there's lots of others. So really, you know, the acknowledgements, you should see it there, think of it as a collaborative project, a kind of build on a long lineage of work. And so I'm going to kind of go into it, maybe first to just introduce some of the overall ideas, and then kind of moving back and forward. So the book argues for a broader temporal framing of abandonment in order to understand overlapping political and socioeconomic trajectories with the biogeophysical evolution that underlies the condition. So how do you bring these kind of socioeconomic trajectories together with the land itself kind of more fully understood? And so in other words, it focuses on sites, circumstance, and context of abandonment, as well as the political, social, economic, and ecological underpinnings and design responses to these conditions. And it thinks about it over long type cycles, uncovering dramatic shifts in the landscape that can be both singular or episodic. It argues that history matters, that past actions and policies have played a fundamental role in the producing and the sustaining abandonment. And it kind of tries to counter a notion that change can only be unidirectional towards advancement or progress. It's trying to debunk a myth that seeks to generalize geographic and temporal situations to kind of imagine vacant land as one thing. And it looks at patterns of growth and decline and their periodic and potentially repetitive nature. But it's really looking at what are these emergent properties of a shrinkage landscape. And in doing so, it tests an idea of cycles with regard to long-term transformation to place this problematic narrative of growth and decline in a relative and contingent lens. So the cycles refer to the evolution of the cities and sites themselves, but also the alterations of specific materials. So you can think of water cycles or plant cycles, crop cycles, material cycles that exist at an elemental level, but they also exist within the built environment as you have development promoting and resisting these cycles, and these cycles promoting and resisting development. And here I want to add a little bit about a cycle, and this is something I've been reflecting on a lot more recently. I don't see it as something that's actually returning to its previous state. And maybe rather more like what ecologist and now MacArthur winner Robin Thalkimmer refers to as a spiral. I think of it more as a dust ball moving through a landscape that's collecting layers and materials as it sort of rolls. So not as if we're trying to go back to some beginning, some static beginning. So that's a brief framework. And I'm going to talk today about the motivations for the project, like why am I doing what I'm doing? Sort of describe the methods, which actually was very difficult for me in this book. Like I think the longer you've been thinking about something, the harder it is to parse it into a thing or to sort of summarize it. And also I think just in terms of design thinking, methodology is something that we don't talk about enough. I'm going to touch briefly on the 5 cities that I represented in the book, and then I'm going to end with some kind of ideas about what I'm thinking about these days, or a reflection and conversation. So to describe the beginning journey, I'm going to begin with this image, which is from this 2011 Indy tour of the United States, which Terry mentioned is where I was last in this building, I think. I don't even know, was it this building? Okay, cool. So I took a tour to understand the diversity of places facing population outmigration. And so I begin with this image because it shows a misalignment of a map view and the view out your window, where the organization on the map, which is like this sort of gridded form, belies the agents on the ground. And the street view is actually a surprise. Like if you saw this map, you might not imagine that street view. You're here in Northeast Ohio. You probably do imagine this maybe more than other places in the world. This is nearby. This is the northwest corner of Youngstown. It's an area that was planned in the 50s and laid out, but never actually occupied. So it's also not as if population left this area. Population sort of never came because planners weren't imagining Black Monday. They weren't imagining a fall of Youngstown Tube and Steel. But at the same time, at the point that I visited, people were moving in. They were riding ATVs. They were, living in this landscape, and it had a kind of rich spontaneity and excitement about it. And I think a lot has changed in mentality since I took the photo. And there's recent films that argue that perhaps the outlook of newer generations is changing, reconciling a trauma of the past with a forward-leaning vision for their city. So as I mentioned, it's this part of, it was an 18-day, 17-city, 5,000-mile off-highway driving tour from the Northeast, where I live on the unceded territory of the Massachusetts and the Pequot and the Nipmuc. And it was through the Midwest. And it's one of many trips that I took in the formation of this book, basically to understand the landscape and its particularities. And so I visited Cleveland at this point, along with many other cities and places. And it's wonderful to be back. And I think this is how I was sort of collecting ideas and reconciling the ground with people's visions, with the narrative that you were hearing and all of these things. And the kind of, I guess what I was most surprised by was a kind of latent optimism in the places and that I visited. But this goes on. I'm gonna stop it there. And also the book and the project and the motivation of the project for the trip and the project go back further. So this is my time as a graduate student in Philadelphia. So if any of you are students, this is my note of warning that perhaps what drives you right now, you might be continuing to think about in a quarter of a century later. So this is North Central Philadelphia, where I did a thesis imagining alternative forms of inhabitation, non-binaries that could occupy the spaces between suburban style developments that were being built at the time. Land was being cleared and they were putting in kind of almost gated communities on the one hand, and these sort of spaces where people were doing nothing, these wilds that were across the street. And I guess the question for me then and now is, it's not whether to build or not. And it's not whether to leave it or not, because there's all of these things in between. And I think we don't really think about those things in between. We're like, should we mow? Should we not mow? But perhaps we should do something that's less binary. And while I was doing that project, so this is going to date me even more, there was this massive 2-volume Shrinking Cities project coming out of Germany, edited by the architect Philip Oswald and team. Probably you're all familiar with it. But at that moment, it was also kind of a breath of fresh air, because it was countering this demographically driven planning account. So it wasn't like things are thinking. It didn't sort of dispute the fact that there was population loss, but it examined the kind of nuance and problematic underpinnings of that. So it was focused on the artistic, the fleeting, the non-physical, social activity. It thought about all of these cultural practices and divorced them from the slowly changing physical properties of the urban landscape. So they're interrelated, but not codependent. Cultural vibrancy can exist in a place of physical decline, I think was really the thesis behind the book. And it was this turning point on the one hand, but on the other hand, I think there's a real warning to issue, which is to say that even if people are resilient and creative, this doesn't lessen the need to address the systems, the broken systems that produce the inequities. The solution can't be to place the care of the city and the supply of its services into the hands of its citizen volunteers. The burden of government and market failure to provide cannot be borne by those who are historically left behind. And it's in fact the failure of government, it's like another pressure. So its absence is a pressure. So you can't be like, but look at all these great things happening, divorced from this responsibility. And the other thing, so to me, it's a repository of things to be mined, critiqued, expanded upon. And this is also, because I'm a landscape architect, also really with regard to the landscape conditions. So there are 2 volumes. They focus on architecture planning, cultural practice, but they barely touch on landscape architecture, ecology, or related fields. So there's 250 entries. This is like showing you the author list, and I've just highlighted the ones that identify in any way with the discipline of landscape. So there are 2 here, and this is the volume on research, and there are 3 here on the volume on interventions. So I think there's on the one hand, it's broad, but on the other hand, there's a lot to work with and to mind. And I guess for those interested in land transformation, the places to begin is with this feral city section. It examines landscapes where wildness meets agriculture, where social networks engage spaces designed out of abandonment, ideas of urbanity. And it's 32 pages that represent a broad spectrum of issues and projects very briefly. And I think this is at the point where I was like, oh, maybe we shouldn't have a whole 100 ideas for something. Maybe we should delve into it. So the challenge for me was for a deeper engagement with some of these ideas presented. So I take the challenge of the deep investigation, both of the feral city and deconstruction, but also of many other lines of thought around abandonment, to expand and critique, but mostly I'm asking, what can a landscape-driven design approach bring to previously occupied and currently abandoned landscapes? And a fun thing about writing a book, I guess, is that you get to curate the bibliography, you get to read the lineages of thought and action around a topic of interest. So you can think about gaps, but you can also celebrate novel perspectives. So who's not being heard, what's not being said. And so the work builds on a long and a broad design literature around the void and its associated terms and engagements, but challenges the implication that the land is empty. Instead, I deliberately have come to the terms of abandonment and fallow to emphasize the deliberate jettisoning of the land. Obviously, metaphorically speaking, you can't throw land away. But also the potential of pause to nurture, restore, and allow for different futures. I recently took a job in the School of Agriculture, and when I interviewed, they were like, "So tell us about this idea of fallow." And I was like, "Wow, I've never actually had this conversation with the School of Agriculture, but I am co-opting the term, and you probably maybe know what I mean by it." But ultimately, the book develops a framework to understand the abandoned and fallow landscapes beyond their aesthetic qualities. So we can't really be sort of fetishizing the spatial quality and the aesthetic quality, but to posit a fundamental role for spatial practice to transform these sites over time. So it's pushing against fetishization of voids, ruins, wildlands, wastelands, and kind of demanding accountability to and reparations for the local inhabitants, past, present, and future. And it's also critiquing a singular parcel level strategies that seek to address systemic issues one lot at a time. It embraces the potential of these transformations to reform logics of capital and real estate markets. So I think that's exciting. But I think if you think of it one little parcel at a time, it's daunting. But think about how you undermine efficiency, monetary return, short-term evaluation, things that we're used to thinking about. How can we sort of think about that? Currently, I've been thinking with land banks, could they set aside property for 40 years and experiment with a voluntary carbon market or with something that actually is longer term, and how much of your land could you think of that way versus needing it to try to get it back into these systems that we currently have for thinking. And it's kind of, I mean, maybe it's ironic because it's actually been sitting that way for more than 40 years. It's just kind of coming to that realization. And so it also understands the deep lineages of damage found in sites of urban abandonment, the unevenness and injustice exposed by planners and geographers, urban historians and sociologists, especially when thinking towards design, and kind of thinking about abandonment within movements of environmental and climate justice over the past 50 years, where perhaps the understanding of ecological entanglement might lead to different forms of valuation, as I'm thinking, different forms of imagination. So I'm kind of indebted to these particular thinkers and writers. Sometimes I'm more critical, sometimes I'm more in awe, but it's kind of building on that lineage. And I guess the aspiration is to see beyond this frame. I don't know if you guys have experienced or played with this 60-year of urban change site, but it's this myopic comparison of then and now. And it just seems like this view that we can't shake, even despite all of this thinking and literature, like how can we not see the world this way, and wipe between then and now and then and now. I think I'm speaking to people who know more about this than I do, but so I'm asking again, what more could a landscape-oriented approach do, or what could a more landscape-oriented approach do? So what more could we do, or what could a more, then you get the idea. So in the book, I'm arguing for the consideration of a longer time frame and a halt to the singular unidirectional notion of growth and progress, as I said, and I'm sort of diving deep and wide. So on the one hand, I want plurality, but on the other hand, I want it to be specific. So how do you kind of think about the deep and the wide at the same time? In order to inject other histories into that aerial slider, we saw then and now, in order to question the preoccupation with the figure ground and other limiting binaries, and to understand the unique properties, I would call them the DNA of these sites, if you will. Like, what are their contexts? What is the physical landscape characteristics? And how are those related to the social, economic, and political drivers? I think another turning point for me in thinking about this book was that I did take a trip to Germany, and I was, the sort of scale and the notion of property seems so different that it seemed hard to have these conversations at the same time. And so while the book does look at different cities in different contexts, I think they have to be understood relative to those contexts. And then the question is, what does it mean to tell these longer stories, and how can we trace the specific material properties of their making and unmaking from the past to the future to continue to argue against the kind of surface condition? And so in the book, the stories are told through the formation, tangible and intangible, of individual sites as they move through cycles of building and unbuilding, from the overall framing of the urban space and the region down to the material condition. So it oscillates in this scale. And it thinks really about the affordances of the land. So what are the key materials, the rudiments that could come together to support life? And so in each chapter, there's a kind of thought on that material condition, whether it be soils that are kind of manipulated very specifically and very adeptly to allow for cultivation in a place that's predominantly dry. So thinking about the hydrology, vegetation, topography, geology, infrastructural capacity, and occupation potential of land lying fallow. And then in linking these long histories, I think it's also important to think about what a landscape-driven design approach can't do, or in other words, to understand that our spatial engagements can't be just within our own bubble, and that the cultural visions for physical landscapes have within them deep complexities of global capital and political and economic decision-making that produce this wildly uneven and racist condition over time. And so I think as designers, we have to understand that, because the land is available, but at the same time, it's not available. It's being sort of deliberately held in that position. So we have to think about what is a design project and what is not, where do we have agency and where do we not, and also to really understand a need for collaboration with other disciplines, with activists, within space making and outside of it. So how do we get out there in the world and offer the skills and tools that we do have, but also recognize the skills and tools that we don't have? And so I argue perhaps our world making endeavors are small, but we can still push for valuation and visions that actively counter a kind of market-driven approach, or a singular market-driven approach, to see the labor of ecology, to value chicory and wild carrot, to see the labor of people not through exploitation, but through respect and compensation. So to really frame it in a kind of idea about hybrid labor conditions. How do you think about the labor of people? How do you think about the labor of ecology? And to push on these alternative value systems, we can look at cycles or spirals, systems, hybrids, gradients that allow us to break free of binaries and linear narratives. So to kind of push beyond people like things like fit in a 2x2 square box, or they, are happily bullet pointed, or you have that one great image, but like, how do we actually resist these sort of tools? So in the project, I consider the overall trajectories of growth and decline, not as growing or declining, but part of this same spiral transformation. And then I also investigate recurrence related to landscape characteristics and design rudiments. So the water, vegetal, crop, and material life cycles. And in the end, each project through these transformations comes together to expose persistent qualities and potentials of the urban landscape. So these changes are understood critically relative to other metric and decision-making cycles, fiscal periods, political terms, decennial census counts that often lead to structural disinvestment and limited readings of vitality. So I think we need to, take a longer view, basically. We say it 100 ways, but as planners and designers, we tend to think of binaries. Is it public or private? Is it cultivated or spontaneous, mown or not mown? But it has limitations. So the projects that I'm looking at are conceived as a gradients, and along those gradients, we see resources deliberately allocated towards maximum social and ecological impact. We know that we can't be returning to previous levels of management and abandonment. And we also know we can't just let things go. Like, we have to actively leave places behind, and that's a responsibility. So it's a design project, and it's actually, I think it's a design project even more so moving forward, because we're currently abandoning places. We're probably going to abandon more places than we ever have, thinking about the climate. So how do we actually learn from our past mistakes of abandoning places to actually do this with justice? And so I think that you could have a strategy that does allocate different levels of resource, but it's not based on land market value, on demographics, on political willpower, but as actually has some kind of equitable distribution. So there would be a range of carefully considered places of high intensity and carefully considered places of low intensity across sites, neighborhoods, cities, and regions that both require this kind of consideration, and that this hybrid approach will give you a different aesthetic or design condition. Okay, so that's I think you get the idea of what I'm trying to argue for. And so kind of looking at the potential of aggregation and transformation, the ability to empower and build communal wealth through land performance, spatial design. And it's, yeah, and how to, and sort of working towards a design approach and methodology that can confront histories of colonization and systemic failure and foreground specific potentials of the land, the importance of cyclical change, the particularities of a context. So the themes are explored through the changing landscapes in 5 cities. So they're they're Philadelphia, Berlin, Lisbon, Amsterdam, and St. Louis. And they're kind of across decades, from periods of great upheaval to the ones of relative stability. And so the idea is to actually put places of difference in relationship with each other with different timescales. And I'm showing the first and the last figure of the book here. Maybe they don't make so much sense out of context, but maybe then that will inspire you to read it a little bit more. I think I'm talking too much. So we'll go a little bit quicker through the motivations. That was the motivations and ambitions. Here are the 5 cities. And in some ways, these cities are chosen for very particular reasons. One has to do with the different type of material transformations that usually take place. So stormwater in Philadelphia, wild spaces in Berlin, agricultural plots in Lisbon, playscapes in Amsterdam, and just also thinking about the fallowness in relationship to St. Louis. So thinking about places where maybe that cycle, that spiral is come around, and places where that spiral has not come around, but also in that gathering of ideas, thinking about what are the key responses to this abandoned condition, and how do we think about them? There are also places where there wasn't a municipal scale project that kind of lend itself down to the nitty-gritty. And so each project is understood through this rudimentary lens. And in the case of Philadelphia, which to me is the first city, the one's kind of from the beginning, the lens is water. You don't have to really read all of this, but Philadelphia has made very specific decisions relative to its water management. So it is about the stormwater systems that are currently in place, but it's also about a series of decisions to keep drinking water within the city as opposed to farming it out. And a number of cities that were decisions that were made maybe with fiscal constraint, but actually drove a kind of different system and innovation. So I'm basically telling you a 350-year story of stormwater and its kind of intersection with clean water. And as I was saying to methodology, we're looking at sort of 4 images from the sequence. There's a sequence of images for each city that are very kind of deliberate. So they were sort of researched, visited, and drawn in a particular manner. So there's a kind of a drawing that I call the key urban structuring element. So a drawing with the waterways and floodways in Philadelphia, different things in different cities. And then there's sort of, these projects are juxtaposed with some kind of urban plan or planning history, in this case of Ian McHarg and Ann Spurn, who've done really interesting work in the city. And then there's a set of sections that relate the plans of a grove to an idea of how you move through the city. And then a kind of particular site. So the sites are then drawn and planned in section over time. There's an axon view that gives a 3-dimensional understanding of the space. And then it's down to the material. So the materials here are wet and dry meadows, and they're sort of photographed and illustrated to provide textural scale and quality. And so that's the general understanding of the roadmap. I was going to look more closely at Berlin, although I'll do it. So the narrative in Berlin is framed around what's called the Gleiswildnis, which has no, and forgive my German, it's terrible, has no equivalent in English, but it's a rail wilderness. So German often, they aggregate words, so they get specificity. So these are particular wildlands that occur along used and disused rail infrastructure. And this sign says, don't go in, this is a wild area. It's in a particular park space. And so with the zoom out, with understanding the city and its structure, those may look like roadways, but actually those are the rail lines across the city. And we're thinking about the rail lines in relationship to the city's biomes. that were carefully documented by a key urban ecologist whose name is Herbert Sukop. And he's kind of a member of what became Berlin School of Ecology. And so starting in the 1950s, Sukop and his colleagues were thinking about the ecological conditions in the city's rural landscapes. By necessity, they could either leave Berlin or they could look at the city itself, because they were sort of, because of the political condition. And so they chose not to leave and look at the areas that they were used to looking at. They actually mapped the species intensively focusing on particular sites over a 50-year period. And they recognized a correlation between species composition and the structure of the city. So they could see the structure of the city through these biotypes. And so that's one sort of view of the city, and you'll have to get the book because it's hard to see the drawings there and they're probably too small on your computer screen. But I'm also thinking about that reading of the city relative to a reading from a series of architects, Ungers being one of them, and his colleagues. They made this iconic city in a city plan. And so this is 1977. They proposed this well-known idea of thinking about the city as an archipelago. We could critique that. But what they were doing was saying, like, we don't want to repair the city as it was. We're arguing against the historical reconstruction of the whole city and concentrating on development around particular places, and create these islands. And you see a lot with the islands which are there. You see very little around the sort of sea, which was the landscape condition. But I was interested in seeing the relationship between these two visions. Do these kind of strongholds hold up with the ecological understanding? And so I started to make these mashups of biotypes and islands, kind of space and imagination collapse, these ideas of wildness brought together. And so over time, some of the wilds have been developed, have been tamed, if you will, and others have been integrated carefully and kind of designed into the urban fabric. And I think as an outsider, when you visit Berlin, you kind of see this rural landscape very present in the city. I think for some of the ecologists, they felt like a lot of their work was lost because, you know, Berlin's history went in one direction rather than the other. But I think there has been some balance between these conditions. And so the book itself is looking at long form text. There's a lot of writing, which is not my favorite thing to do, but I guess I managed. And a kind of image together. And so we can move a little bit more quickly through the chapter to kind of understand that. I chose to focus in this chapter on this site that's Grünelager Halsestrasse. It's probably not the most well-known of the Berlin landscapes, but it's the first site of rural vegetation conservation. So it's a place in which they took rubble piles from war destruction that had a kind of black locust woodland growing on them, and saw a kind of value in the space, both socially and ecologically, and sort of preserved it. And to my knowledge, it's like the first of that kind of conservation happening. And so here you see the accent of the site, but then you see the kind of making of that site, of what its history is behind it. And over time, vegetation well suited to the dry, poor soil conditions colonized the landscape, beginning with a 30-year process of succession from a fallow ground to herbaceous meadow to dry woodland. And now you have these like really wonderful craggy black locusts that you walk through. They have very idiosyncratic tree forms, maybe not like the ones I drew, but I was trying to understand the growth patterns and nutrient cycling of the black locust. And you get these tree forms that have this extensive canopy over the space that's now been turned into a kind of nature playground for the school adjacent to it, which is what you're kind of seeing in some of those images. And so the section of plants there are shown with the site connected to the rails and the backbones of the wilderness. So you see that scale. You also see the scale of walks through the region and the parks, which are incorporating this wild vegetation in remarkable and different ways. And so the city has this elaborate set of 20 walks that you go through. It's tracing sort of one of those as you move out and through. And the sites that I look at embody this idea of a gradient and hybrid that I invoked earlier, that you see in the Sugalanda and Gleistriak site, that are both kind of elaborated in this idea of wilds in practice. So you could think of the Grünelager Halsestrasse as a conserved wild, The nature park, Sugalande, is kind of conserved wild, but operating as a park. And at Gleistriac, it's a park with its patches of conserved wild kind of as you move across the space. And the three sit in an even broader network of a remarkable landscape project in Berlin, cycling outward, as this last diagram is trying to show historical and design cycles together, kind of intertwined as a wheel of interdependency, where you're thinking of events related temporally. And the techniques together relate history and space, analysis and imagination dynamically over time. And the Berlin, the text and drawings elaborate on these sites of past abandonment and fallowness and their transformation through the lens of the urban wilds, which has a particular place in Berlin. So I think one of the other things I'm arguing is just because this is what Berlin is doing doesn't mean Cleveland should do it or some other place should do it. It has a particular place. It's what scholars Jens Luckman and Sonja Dumpelman have kind of talked about eloquently in their work, that they're theoretical innovations that are linked to specific places. And this wide embrace of wild vegetation is particular to Berlin. It's a Berlin-specific ecological awareness. Sorry. So I'm just going to touch on like what is the DNA of these other cities. So, and the kind of sequence of them. So in Lisbon, the structure is marked by the valleys and soils. I don't know if any of you have drawn Lisbon or been to Lisbon, but typically it's seen as its hills. It's a city of hills. But I would argue perhaps it's also a city of valleys, and those valleys have the soil and the kind of armature of the city's ecological plan. And they have a late landscape architect, Gonzalo Riviere Tellish, with his colleagues. He was actually also a political figure. They developed a kind of ecological plan for the city through these valleys about cultivation, but also about wind movement and other types of systems. And they had these agricultural parks where you had hortas or allotment gardens, typically gardened by Cape Verdean immigrants to the city that are organized for subsistence farming. And so this chapter is all about the relationship of agronomy to Lisbon over hundreds of years, I guess 500 years of thinking about the city's relationship to agronomy and landscape planning. In Amsterdam, the interstices and canals provide the armature. They're set in dialogue with housing expansion and playgrounds. So the cycle that I focus on is quite short. We're only looking at 100 years here, but we're exploring different periods of trajectories in the framework. And so also to put different places into dialogue with each other, calling out these fundamental forms of intervention. So play here, and its essential material is sand. So it looks at the history of sand relative to playgrounds as kind of the material of a playground, but also in relationship to Amsterdam's formation and play. And that brings us to St. Louis, which is the last of the cities. And here we're talking about highways, levees, and bridges. The structuring element is the highways. And they're drawn out to expose the terrain, which has a lot of sinkholes, floods, mounds, woodlands, bricks, and annual plantings. And it's extremely divided socioeconomic and racial conditions. So it's the kind of place to consider contemporary abandonment and consider a relationship between the fragility of the physical terrain, which is built on karst, and the kind of fragility of the social terrain, and how you kind of think about those two things and what does it mean to be in the middle of one of these spirals as opposed to at a different point in the spiral, if you will. Okay, so with the last couple of minutes, and then we can open it up to some conversation. I'm going to just give a couple of reflections, both on ideas that are in the actual conclusion of the book, but also ideas of where to go from here, knowing what we know now and experiencing what we're currently experiencing. I think as a designer, we tend to want to write a history of the present, which is impossible to do because then the present shifts and our history shifts, and it takes a long time to write a book. So, you aren't necessarily thinking about exactly the same things. So I don't have answers or solutions, but I have a couple of thoughts. One, that I think pausing does bring new formations, that fast is not better. But that when we pause, it doesn't mean we're doing nothing. We need to kind of support and empower, question and demand, disrupt and reorder. So a pause doesn't mean just like wait for the next great thing to happen. It's an active engagement. And that we also need to think about different forms of pedagogy, practice, and project, which I think actually people are doing more and more. In other words, the way we value and understand our work as designers needs to be different in order to embrace things that are incomplete, that are evolving, that are collective. So I think those are exciting new thoughts. And that these offer different modes or different ways of working, different skill sets. I'm thinking about sort of gerunds as guides, listening and observing. I'm also trying to think like probably we should have gerunds for other senses. I haven't thought enough about that yet, but also ideas about partnering and splicing. Some of these things are individual actions, some are collective. And to me, splicing is a spatial action, a metaphor, a literal operation. There's a social psychiatrist, Mindy Foley-Love. I don't know if you guys look at her work. She thinks she's amazing. And she talks a lot about the ill effects of fragmentation on community, which is one, I think, brilliant thing. The other thing is to try to lower the temperature in the room. So like you can't really make a decision if the temperature isn't lowered in the room, which seems like solid advice. And it seems like probably not the state we're in right now. So something to think about. And so I think with this and the active work of many others, I still have optimism, maybe more so than when I took the 2011 road tour. I chose to pick Braddock, Pennsylvania, a place I visited at that moment, because in terms of the temperature in the room, it seemed pro. So things aren't better, but I think there's actions and leadership and ways of working that hold potential. For me personally, it's in a project that I'm currently engaged in. I'm co-directing a fellowship that's called the Climate Justice Design Fellowship, whose mission is to kind of empower environmental justice activists and public servants from around the US to design and build accessible data and design tools really that help them promote equity and justice in their communities. And so these are the inaugural fellows. And to me, they're kind of incredibly inspiring. And my role in this is to kind of work hard to directly support local communities and their leaders who are advocating for and realizing their own optimal futures with respect to climate change, to increase free access to data and design tools on environmental issues, as well as putting them in a well-designed, consistent environment that's human-friendly, to transform accessibility to empower justice advocates and public servants. So to actually give them ownership of the impact analysis, and then to support research in sociology, design, and climate through direct collaboration with the community users of these tools, and to kind of investigate and spatialize possible future scenarios. And so I think these to me it's a different way of working for me, and I think it offers some ideas for the future. I think it's also quite tricky as to how you actually are empowering people and not leaving the knowledge and leadership there. And it's been great for me because I do have a bias and a particular point of view that I always have to be like, maybe it's not about how I think it should look, or how I think it should perform and that sort of thing. So how do I kind of understand what are my core skills and how those are associated or disassociated from whatever training and bias I have. And then in terms of abandonment and urban property, I've been excited about what the Trumbull Neighborhood Partnership was nearby and Warren doing, and Build Baton Rouge. That's just about trying to spread wealth or empower people. And so in the latter case at Build Baton Rouge, they had been working with applications of ideas of co-governance that is found in work of scholars Sheila Foster and Christian Iannone. So how do you actually develop co-governance models? I think a lot of people are working around that. And that you're sort of moving away from traditional notions of capital and ownership, or this framing of nature's capital or ecosystem services, instead of trying to make what we do be of value in that terms. How do we think about humans and non-humans owning their own labor? How is that a collectivity? There's a political theorist, Alyssa Battistoni, who thinks about this idea of hybrid labor. And so to me, these seem like threads as I carry this decades-long project into the next decades. And really, as I was saying at one point, think about how these past lessons for abandonment, both how we address those places that have been abandoned in the past, but also how do we think about how they have lessons for the future climate-driven abandonment, and how do we think about different frames of gift giving and spirals and other notions of learning. All right, with that, thanks for listening. I encourage you to read the book. Thank you. And I can take comments or
At
questions.
this time, we'll open up the floor for any questions for Joe.
I'll try to moderate and I'll try to repeat the question for those that are watching live on.
I'm just curious what your thoughts are, or if you have any kind of opinion on some of the more well publicized kind of like reclamation of sort of urban fallow spaces like the High Line or the Belt Line, underline, above line now, just like how those projects would fit into sort of your kind of conceptualization of reclaiming lanes.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are several answers to that question. Maybe I do think that those particular projects maybe are on the aestheticizing and spectrum of things. Not that I don't think, I mean, I'm excited for how to, I mean, I have a design background, so I'm excited about, you know, design and space making, but I do think that A, there's a fair amount of displacement involved in those. B, they're not necessarily replicable. I mean, they're very expensive projects. So I don't know, to me, they are not necessarily in the same framework or addressing the same type of landscapes. And I think there are more movements to kind of do no harm or to think about your project in a lens of harm and care. And I think if you thought about some of those projects, there's still a fair amount of harm involved in them. Obviously, it's tricky. I mean, I came to academia and I was like, it's so exciting now. I can just do projects that don't have to, you know, have clients or make money or like, you know, you can be a little bit idealistic because obviously those projects do bring in a lot of resources to the city. And then I think it's like, how are those resources being allocated, or how would you, and on one side, on the other side, like if you took that initial capital, like how would you distribute it differently? So I think in all cases, like you should actually look at the full, I guess, accountability of a project. And so I think we're doing more of that. So I think you saw at the beginning, a lot of things about the way in which it looks or like its design features, and you're seeing more like critical analysis of it. And I think as a discipline, we're pushing that way, like to do evaluations of the work that we're doing. Like we're sort of trained to be like, and it's all going to work. Like this is this amazing thing and it's all going to work. And so, I mean, yes, maybe we need to say that to kind of convince people of our skill set, but at the same time, like we actually should evaluate what has happened with the project. So I don't know, they don't fit in my mind in the same sort of category. They are, and I guess they're somewhat singular. So I think if you can do more, like you could think of Gasworks Park, or you could think of all these places where it's like the brownfields or even Duisburg, like they were radical in the sense that they made a public space out of something that wasn't designed to be a public space, but that's sort of the extent of what they did. So like, how do you bring in more systems? How do you think about the materials? How do you think about labor? How do you think about generating other kinds of performance out of a project?
Are there like, sorry,
Yeah.
are there like, I guess, well, you talked about Berlin, but I guess I'm also curious if there's like US-based projects that you would see as like best practice in action of the type of thing we're talking about.
I mean, yeah, I think that's a great question. I mean, I think there are projects that are maybe more, I guess the ones that sort of seed wealth back to a community, I think are more best practices in that regard. I mean, I guess the book itself is arguing for like a framework of thinking and like a consideration of all of these things. I think I am interested in, models where you actually have generated a lot of jobs around land. I mean, I think ideally you could generate sort of an ecological benefit and a social benefit at the same time. There's one of the parks in Philadelphia, Liberty Lands, that's like, I mean, I think from a design perspective, you wouldn't be like, wow, that's an amazing project, but I think it has a lot of a kind of amazing properties and attributes that go to it. And actually, there's some really lovely groves of trees. It's like you do sort of like to be there, even if like your initial like drive-by view of isn't like, wow, but it's actually a very lovely place to spend the afternoon. And it was sort of fought for by the neighborhood and belongs to the community organization and has been able to pull some stormwater from the street. And yeah, I mean, it does have sort of issues, but I think just trying to balance those particular models across. I'll think more on, I'll follow up on some like more good practices.
Any other in the back?
I had a question. You brought up the lens.
Uh-huh.
I saw on that map and watched the record from on the board. And they discovered that temporal airport is growing.
Yeah.
And opened it up to exhibition of the abandoned airfield. And they actually created a ecological research lab in one of the water runoff spaces or infrastructures. I wasn't sure in say one of the greatest benefits of that research lab was just putting on rubber boots and playing around in the kind of swamp area and get like get mud and getting all into the actual landscape. So I wasn't sure what your kind of idea of the potential of creating these like abandoned infrastructural spaces that are many times fenced in and opening that up and like allowing access to those places like park space, kind of not building, but just places in which to discover.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's always going to be a balance in a way between, so I guess my gut answer would be like, you want the kind of gradient of that. So I think you do want spaces that are immersive for people to kind of be in a city and have that experience. And you can test actually what that means to the ecological functioning of it. I think there are probably also places that should be kind of off limits and places. But I think also to the earlier question, Tempelhof is a good example. So Tempelhof is a space that had a vision, had a design competition around it. You maybe all know this. And a set of development and the protests, I mean, like they had opened the site to people to kind of, and people love the site so much that they effectively protest all of that development, and it left this kind of open experimental space for the longer future. I mean, probably it needs to go with it some recognition of that airport's kind of history within Berlin and kind of racist history within Berlin as well. So like if you could mix that in, you'd really be kind of touching on some of these, like the power of that open space to offer, current and moving forward exciting places for people to be, to sort of reconcile with its past and also to have an ecological potential. And it is public, so I guess it is in some cases owned by the city. But I think to that end, to this last part where I was talking about the justice pieces, it's so different there. I think that's where, you need a deep dive into that particular context and what makes sense.
I think we can do one more question. Carrie? Well, I would like to sort of remind you to bring this kind of approach the musical version. They want to come out by the way we do is community based, so we're all up for,
Yeah.
I want to do that. Any advice about how to use the funding generation approach? How do you find the space to be able to speak on positive? Of course, correct, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I think in previous, like, as it's been a long project at the very beginning, it was like, yes, we're so excited, but like, isn't this irresponsible to people who are living there, who want something and deserve something, yesterday, much less today. And so I do think there are larger movements towards, I don't know how that pause could be part of the community project. And I think there is more, I guess, thinking and literature around rest or restoration or like Jordan Weber, I don't know, is our Midwestern artist who's been doing a lot with kind of remediating toxicity in the land itself, but also how that is a process of building health for the community. And so, yeah, I think it's through translation to some degree, or like elaborating on the benefits of the pause itself. I mean, maybe the Berlin example is also like, if you, which you probably are doing, which is like testing different alternatives and then seeing how that could move forward. As long as, I mean, I think for a long time, the pitfall around this kind of question was that things were too temporary. Like, yes, temporarily you can do anything, but like for the long term, we're gonna, hold this aside for some, development that's ultimately going to push you out of this neighborhood or space. But I think some merger of the duration of the project, but that the space itself is for the long term, but the project is more short term.
Well, that takes us to the close of the afternoon. Thank you so much, Jill, and thank you for those that are online that joined us for your attendance. If you're here again for continuing educational credits, we have papers that you can sign and over by Donna, I assume. And then those of you that are online, it might be in the text message, the chat area where you can answer questions, or I'm not sure how you turn them in, but there should be a link there that yes, the online form, it was, I think, at the top there. We just went by. So thank you again to the Ohio Western Reserve American Society of Landscape Architects for providing refreshments for those of us in person, and to the College of Architecture and Environmental Design for having this lecture series. Thank you everyone for coming in on such a gorgeous day. And again, thanks, Jen.
Yeah, thank you.